Nothing about that isolated cooper's cabin was normal, and the worst part wasn't what tried to get in. Ezekiel Crane made barrels in a Blue Ridge hollow so deep that no road had ever reached it, and he lived alone, with the sound of his own work. Then his breathing started coming back from the ridge, not as an echo, but as a separate thing that learned his rhythm and then improved on it. The voice followed, using his words, his accent, the wet click in his throat, until Crane couldn't tell where he ended, and the sound began. He spent his last month barricaded inside a workshop that had become a tomb, while something outside practiced being him. There is a kind of silence that only exists in the Blue Ridge hollows. It's not the silence of empty rooms or sleeping cities. It's another kind, older and denser, the sort that seems to press against your ears and wait for you to make the first sound. The wind that moves through those high valleys doesn't behave the way wind does in open country. It bounces off the ridges, gets trapped in the bowl-shaped hollows, and comes back from directions that don't make sense. A man on one slope can hear his own axe strike return from 3 different ridges, each delayed by a different interval, until it sounds like someone else is working in the woods with him. In 1886, the Blue Ridge Mountains were still a frontier inside the country itself. The railroads followed the valleys and river gaps, but the high hollows were left alone. There were no telephones, no telegraph wires, no paved roads. If you wanted to travel from one cove to the next, you walked a deer path and carried everything on your back. The mist in those hollows rises from the valleys like cold smoke, especially between midnight and dawn. It pulls in the low places as if the hollow itself is holding its breath. Sound travels strangely when the air is that heavy and damp. A voice from 100 yards away might seem to come from beside you. East Tennessee State University folklorists collected dozens of accounts from southern Appalachian communities where people described hearing perfectly imitated voices, familiar calls, the sound of friends speaking from ridges where no human could possibly stand. The witnesses were farmers, hunters, loggers who knew the difference between a fox bark and a dog bark. Certain hollows amplify and reflect sound in ways that create eerie repetitions. Wind moving through different densities of mountain air can produce tones that resemble human speech. But the precision of the imitated voices, the way they matched specific accents and cadences, kept the stories alive across generations. The mountain people didn't need a supernatural explanation to find the phenomena disturbing. In 1886, the Blue Ridge was full of men who lived alone because they preferred it, or because they had no choice. Timber cutters, fur trappers, herb gatherers, and craftsmen whose trades required more space than a town lot could provide. Among them were the coopers, the barrel makers, whose work generated noise that would have driven any neighbor to distraction. The ring of hammers on iron hoops, the scrape of draw knives on oak, the whistle of steam bending wood into impossible shapes, these sounds defined a cooper's workspace. And in 1886, the cooper's trade was still essential. Every distillery needed barrels, every farm needed storage casks for corn, for salt pork, for the rendered fat that would last through winter. One of these men was Ezekiel Crane, who worked on a ridge called Miller's Brow, where the acoustics were stranger than most. By the spring of 1886, the sounds of his workshop were the only conversation he knew. But the mountains were preparing to answer back. Ezekiel Crane was 53 years old in the spring of 1886, an age that meant something different in those mountains than it does now. He was not old, but he was not young. He had the kind of body that came from decades of swinging a hammer and bending over a workbench, heavy in the shoulders and thick in the forearms, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the oak he shaped for a living. His eyes were pale and steady, and they moved slowly when he looked at you, as if he was measuring something he didn't plan to discuss. Crane had been a cooper for 30 years, maybe more. The records from that part of the Blue Ridge are incomplete, and in 1886 nobody was keeping close track of a man who lived 3 hours' walk from the nearest settlement. What we know comes from the whiskey haulers who climb to his cabin twice a year, and from one written account by Hollis Barger, who found Crane in the spring of 1887. Barger described Crane's clothing as stiff with flour-crusted canvas, the kind of fabric that gets rubbed with oak dust and fat until it becomes almost like leather. His boots were cracked and risoled with scraps of hoop iron, and his fingers were stained dark from tannin, his nails split and yellow from repeated contact with wet oak. The cabin sat on a shelf of land halfway up Miller's Brow. It was not large. One room served as living space, with a sleeping loft, reached by a ladder of pegs driven into the wall. The other half, separated by a partial wall that stopped short of the roof beams, was the workshop. This was where Crane spent his waking hours, surrounded by staves in various stages of completion, iron hoops hanging from pegs, and the tools of his trade laid out on a bench he had built from poplar planks. A shaving horse sat near the door. Steam box, for bending wood, occupied one corner, fired by a small stove he kept burning almost continuously during working hours. The sounds of that workshop were specific and relentless. The draw knife made a scraping noise that rose and fell depending on the curve of the wood. The hammer driving hoops onto a barrel produced a bright, ringing percussion that could carry for half a mile on a still day. The steam box hissed and gurgled as water dripped onto hot iron, and underneath these sounds, always present but rarely noticed, was Crane's own breathing. A man working alone doesn't think about the sound of his own respiration. It's part of the background, like the creak of floorboards under his boots. But in that cabin, with its thin walls and its location on a slope that caught and held sound, Crane's breathing had become part of the acoustic signature of the space. It was as much a feature of the room as the smell of wet oak or the yellow light through the single window. We don't know much about Crane's life before Miller's Brow. The hauler said he never mentioned family, never spoke of a wife or children, never received letters. He might have been a widower, or a man who never married, preferring the conversation of wood to human complications. The Appalachian Mountains have always attracted that kind of person, men and women who found the noise of town life unbearable and retreated to the hollows, where the only social requirement was the ability to mind your own business. Crane was not unfriendly, according to Barger, but he was taciturn in the way mountain people recognized as a choice rather than a deficiency. He would answer a direct question about the price of barrels or the quality of oak. But he did not volunteer information, and he did not ask for any in return. The haulers who visited in the fall of 1885 reported nothing unusual. Crane had a dog, a rangy hound mix that slept in the workshop and followed him to the spring. The barrels he produced were tight and true. The oak staves fitted so precisely that you could shine a light through the seam and see no gap. He delivered his orders on time, and accepted payment in cash or in trade cornmeal and salt, and the occasional bottle of the whiskey his barrels would eventually hold. If there was anything wrong with Ezekiel Crane in the autumn of 1885, it was not visible to men who had known him for years, and who had no reason to look for trouble where none existed. But the winter of 1885 to 1886 was harder than usual. The snow came early and stayed late, and the trails became impassable for weeks at a time. Crane would have been alone in his cabin from November until March, nearly 4 months, with no human contact and no sound except what he produced himself or what the forest provided. Many mountain families spent their winters in similar isolation. But Crane was alone, without even a wife or children to break the silence, and his only occupation during those frozen months would have been repairing tools, preparing staves, and waiting for the weather to break. It was during this winter, or perhaps in the early spring that followed, that something began to change in the auditory world around Ezekiel Crane. We can't know the exact date because Crane kept no journal, and because the first experiences were subtle enough that he might not have recognized them as significant. But by late April of 1886, the pattern was established. and by May it had become the central fact of his existence, the thing around which every other activity began to orbit, until finally there was nothing else. The first thing Crane noticed was not a voice. Voices would come later, and when they did, they would be worse than anything before. But in the beginning, it was just his own breathing returned from the slope behind the cabin. He would be working at the bench, shaping staves, and he would hear it a breath, in and out, that matched his rhythm exactly, but arrived a half beat late, as if someone on the ridge was breathing in time with his labor. At first, Crane thought it was an echo. The cabin sat in a hollow that caught sound the way a barrel catches water, holding it and returning it from unexpected angles. He had lived there long enough to know the mountain could throw his axe strike back from 3 directions, or make a call to his dog seem to come from upstream when the animal was asleep on the porch. So he dismissed the breathing as another trick of the terrain, a reflection of his own respiration bouncing off the granite shelf behind the hollow. He kept working, told himself it was just the mountain doing what the mountain always did. But echoes don't improve. An echo is mechanical, sound bouncing off a surface and returning with the same pattern but less force. It doesn't learn, it doesn't adjust its timing. By the second week of May, Crane realized the breathing was no longer arriving late. It was synchronized with him now, inhale matching inhale, exhale matching exhale, the way 2 men working side by side might fall into the same rhythm without planning it, except there was no one beside him. There was no one within 3 hours' walk. And the sound came from the tree line, from the dense rhododendron and laurel thickets above his spring, where a human could not stand without breaking branches and making noise that would carry for 100 yards. Crane stopped working one afternoon and stood at the workshop door, looking up at the ridge. The breathing continued for 3 more cycles while he stood there, perfectly matching his own, then stopped. Not fading out the way an echo would, but cutting off abruptly, as if whatever was making it had noticed his attention and chosen to go silent. Crane waited several minutes, his own breath shallow and quick from tension, and heard nothing but wind in the new leaves and water running off the mountain. He went back inside. He did not speak aloud. Speaking to himself would have felt like acknowledging something he wasn't ready to name. That night, lying in his loft with the dog asleep on the floor below, Crane heard the breathing again. This time it came from beneath the cabin, or from the space between the logs where the chinking had cracked and fallen away. It was his breathing, the same wet rattle in the throat he had developed over years of inhaling oak dust, the same slight whistle on the exhale that came from a deviated septum he had probably possessed since birth. These were not sounds a mountain could reproduce through echo or reflection. They were the specific acoustic signature of Ezekiel Crane's lungs, produced with a fidelity that made his skin tighten in a way no cold wind could duplicate. He sat up in the darkness. The dog was awake too, standing rigid with hackles raised and nose pointed toward the floor. It didn't growl. Mountain dogs don't waste growls on threats they don't understand. They stand still, they listen, they wait for the human to decide what happens next. Crane reached for the draw knife he kept beside his pallet, not because a blade would be useful against what he was hearing, but because holding a tool was the only response his body knew. He sat there until dawn, breathing as quietly as he could, listening to his own respiration returned from the dark space beneath the loft. The dog refused to enter the workshop the next morning. Crane called it, whistled the 2-note pattern he had used for years, but the animal stayed on the porch with its tail tucked and its eyes fixed on the door. Eventually it wandered down toward the spring and did not return for 3 days. Hollis Barker saw the dog running loose in the valley and thought Crane must have lost it or let it go, because he couldn't feed it through the lean spring months. It didn't occur to Barker that the dog might have chosen to leave. By late May the breathing had developed variations. Crane would hear a sigh that matched his own, produced at the end of a long day when he exhaled more fully than usual. He would hear a sharp intake, the kind of breath a man takes when he remembers something unpleasant, arriving from the ridge at the exact moment the memory surfaced in his own mind. The entity was not simply repeating him anymore. It was anticipating, learning the patterns of his body well enough to predict when he would breathe deeply, when he would hold his breath, when the rhythm would change from work to rest. Crane began sleeping in the workshop rather than the loft. The smaller space felt safer. Though the walls were thinner, the gaps in the chinking were larger. He told himself it was because the workshop was warmer, closer to the stove, and because he had orders to fill. But the truth was that the loft had become unbearable. The space beneath it seemed to collect sound the way it collected moisture. Every breath Crane took in the night was returned from below, and after several weeks he no longer knew whether he was hearing himself or something else. The boundary between his own body and the auditory world outside had begun to dissolve. In the first week of June the knocking started. 3 sharp impacts on the cabin's plank door, delivered at irregular intervals, sometimes in the middle of the day, and sometimes after midnight, when the mountain was so still that the sound seemed to come from inside his own skull. The first time Crane was shaping a barrel head at the bench, and he stopped with the adze held in mid-strike. The knocks had been unmistakable. Wood on wood from the door that led to the outside porch. He didn't open it. Instead, he stood at the door with the adze in his hand and waited. The breathing came from the other side, slow and deliberate, matching his own accelerated respiration. Then silence. Crane stood there for perhaps 10 minutes, listening to the absence of sound with an intensity that made his ears ring. Eventually he sat back down, without resuming work, staying in the yellow light from the window and listening until the knocks did not come again that day. They came again 2 nights later, in the hour before dawn. This time Crane was already awake, sitting on his work stool with his back against the wall, because sleep had become something he rationed rather than surrendered to. He heard the knocks. He heard the breathing that followed. And then, for the first time, he heard something that was not breathing, and was not wood on wood. It was a click. The wet click of his own throat, the small sound he made when swallowing after a long silence, produced from the other side of the door with a perfection that made his hands begin to shake. He had not swallowed. He was certain of this, because he had been holding his breath, listening, and his throat was dry and still. The click came from outside, from whatever stood on the porch in the darkness, and it was his click, his throat, his body, reproduced by something that had never possessed a throat at all. This was when Crane began to change. The men who climbed to his cabin twice a year would not have recognized the man he became in those final months. He stopped shaving and stopped washing his clothes. The flour-crusted canvas became stiff with grime and sweat until the smell of his body blended with the smells of the workshop. His hands, which had been steady enough to drive a hoop onto a barrel without marking the oak, began to shake during the simplest tasks. He ruined 3 barrels in 1 week, driving hoops too deep and splitting staves, or failing to seat the heads so the casks leaked when he tested them with water. The precision required for coopering is absolute, and a leaking barrel is worthless. Crane knew this, had known it for 30 years. But knowledge and execution had become separated in his mind, the way a man might know the path down a mountain and still be unable to walk it because his legs have forgotten how to obey. He would start a task at the bench and find himself listening instead of working, his body frozen while his ears strained to catch the next sound from the ridge or the walls or the floor. The dog did not return. Crane never mentioned it to the haulers who visited in the fall, and they assumed it had died or run off, the way mountain dogs sometimes did. But the absence mattered. A dog provides something no human conversation can replace, a presence that registers sounds before the human ear catches them. Without the dog, Crane had no early warning. He had only his own senses, and his senses were becoming less reliable with every passing week. By mid-June, Crane had stopped leaving the cabin for any purpose except the most essential. He relieved himself in a corner of the workshop rather than walking to the privy 50 yards away. He ate dried corn and the last of his salt pork, and when that ran low he subsisted on cornmeal mixed with water, and cooked in a pan he never bothered to wash. The breathing continued, coming now not just from the ridge or beneath the floor, but from the walls themselves, through the gaps where the dried chinking had fallen away. Crane could hear it from 3 directions at once. His own respiration returned in triplicate, slightly out of phase, so that it sounded like multiple versions of himself were standing in the room, breathing at different rates. The effect was disorienting in a way that mere volume could not achieve, making him feel that his body was not one thing but many, that the sound of his own life had been captured and distributed through the structure of the cabin like water seeping through porous stone. This was when he built the first barricade. He took staves from a barrel he had ruined, drove them between the door and the frame, and added the heavy iron hoops to reinforce the barricade. It was not a rational response. The door already had a bolt, a thick piece of oak that slid into a bracket, mortised into the frame. The barricade was redundant, a gesture of control in a situation where control had become impossible. But Crane needed the gesture. He needed to feel that he had done something, constructed some defense against a threat that had no visible form. The breathing answered by moving closer. It came from the chinking beside his head when he lay on his pallet. It came from the space above the rafters where the bats nested in summer. It was his breathing, but it was also not his breathing. It had developed qualities that his own lungs did not possess, variations in rhythm that suggested something experimenting with the mechanism, trying different patterns. It would hold a note longer than Crane could hold his own breath, stretching the exhale into a low hiss that continued for 20 seconds, 30 seconds, longer than any human lung could sustain. Then it would stop, and Crane would hear his own breathing resume, and he would realize he had been holding his breath, without knowing it, waiting to see what the other sound would do next. In the last week of June, Crane stopped opening the door entirely. The whiskey haulers were not due until September, and he had enough stores to last until then, if he rationed carefully. He told himself he was being prudent. The trails were muddy from summer rains, and he was behind on his orders. But the truth was simpler and worse. The door had become a membrane between 2 spaces he no longer understood. On one side was the cabin, the workshop, the familiar smells of oak and iron, and his own unwashed body. On the other side was the ridge, the hollow, the breathing that had learned his lungs so thoroughly it could predict when he would inhale before he did. He barricaded the door with every piece of wood and metal he could move without compromising the roof. He drove barrel staves between the planks and bent iron hoops, wedging them into the gaps. A second bolt he improvised from a piece of hoop iron, hammered into a bracket he shaped from an old draw-knife blade. Then he added a third. The door was now sealed with more hardware than most bank vaults in the cities below. And still Crane did not feel safe. He felt the way a man feels when he has locked himself in a room filling with water and forgotten whether he has the key. The realization came to him gradually, or perhaps it struck him all at once in one of the sleepless nights that had become his normal routine. The entity was not just copying his voice. It was learning the physical mechanism of his body, the way air moved in and out of his chest, the particular wet click his throat made on the inhale, the slight whistle of his septum on the exhale. These were not characteristics of sound that could be imitated through acoustic tricks. They were characteristics of Ezekiel Crane's specific biology. The thing outside was not learning to sound like him. It was learning to be him, breath by breath, until the difference between the original and the copy became a question with no answer. This knowledge produced a strange effect in Crane. He was no longer frightened, in the way he had been in May, when the sounds were new, and could still be dismissed as tricks of the terrain. Now he was frightened in a deeper way, the way a man might feel if he woke up and discovered that his reflection in the mirror was moving a fraction of a second before he moved. The fear was not of death or pain, it was of replacement. It was of the possibility that he was becoming unnecessary to his own existence. He tried to break the pattern, holding his breath for as long as he could, and counting the seconds until his lungs burned and his vision began to pulse with black spots. The breathing from the walls continued without him preserving the cadence of Ezekiel Crane's respiration in his absence, through a rhythm it had already learned. When he finally gasped for air, the outside breathing adjusted instantly, matching his ragged inhale with a precision that suggested it had been waiting for him to resume. He tried breathing in short, irregular bursts, disrupting the pattern he had maintained for 53 years. And the walls answered with the same irregularity, as if it found his variation interesting and worth incorporating into its growing model. The cabin had become a sealed tomb, but it was not silent. The workshop was filled with the sounds of Crane's trade, the scrape of the draw knife and the ring of the hammer, and underneath these sounds, always present, was the respiration that came from everywhere and nowhere. Crane worked because stopping was impossible. A cooper who stops working is no longer a cooper, and Crane had nothing else to hold on to. But his hands shook, and his barrels leaked, and the orders the haulers would collect in September were not going to be filled. He kept working because the alternative was to sit still and listening had become more dangerous than any labor. July brought heat that the Blue Ridge hollows trapped and held like a hand cupped over a mouth. The air in the cabin became thick with the smell of sweat and oak dust and the sharp metallic tang of iron rusting in the humidity. Crane stopped washing entirely. His clothing, already stiff with flour-crusted canvas, became encrusted with grime that held the shape of his body like a mold. He no longer looked like a man. He looked like a statue that had been left in a forest until the moss and the dust had claimed it. The sounds began to come from inside the cabin walls. This was the change Crane had been dreading without knowing he was dreading it. The moment when the membrane between himself and the entity finally broke down. Standing at the bench with the stave and the shaving horse, he would hear footsteps walking the length of the cabin behind him. The floorboards creaked where he creaked, but delayed by half a second, as if something was practicing the way he walked and had not yet mastered the timing. He would spin around with the draw knife raised, and the room would be empty, except for the barrels, the tools, and the dust drifting in the pale glow from the window. The footsteps were not the worst of it. The worst was the sighing. Crane had a particular way of exhaling when he finished a difficult task, a long release of breath that carried the tension of his shoulders and the fatigue of his back. He heard this sigh coming from the loft above him, from the space where his sleeping pallet still sat undisturbed because he had not climbed the ladder in weeks. The sigh was perfect, with the same length, the same drop in pitch, the same slight rattle in the throat. But Crane was not sighing. Instead, holding his breath and standing rigid at the bench, listening to his own body, produced sounds from a location where his body was not. In the hallucinations of exhaustion, which came more frequently now because he had stopped sleeping in any organized way, Crane saw things that his rational mind would not accept. He saw the flour dust on his clothing shift into the shape of a second set of footprints beside his own, pressed into the grime on the floorboards, and he saw his reflection in the window at night, breathing out while he was breathing in, smiling at him with a mouth that did not open. These visions did not frighten him as much as they should have. A man who has been frightened continuously for weeks develops an immunity to shock, the way a body develops calluses in response to repeated friction. Crane had reached a state where the impossible had become ordinary, and the ordinary had become impossible. He could no longer remember what silence sounded like, or what it felt like to take a breath without hearing it returned from the walls. His memory of the world before the breathing had begun to fade, replaced by a continuous present where the only reality was his own body duplicated and sent through every beam and plank of the cabin. The barrels seemed to hold sound instead of liquid. Crane built 3 good casks before the trouble started, tight barrels that would have held whiskey without leaking a drop. Now he found himself putting his ear to the bent oak and listening. Inside he heard nothing at first. only the silence a well-made barrel should contain. But as he held his ear against the wood, he began to detect a faint rhythm, a pulse that matched his own heartbeat but seemed to come from deep inside the oak. The barrel was not empty, but full of something that had no weight and no color, something accumulated inside the wood, and now occupying the space where the whiskey should have gone. Crane never spoke aloud during these weeks. Speaking would have required a kind of normality that no longer existed. But he began to think in words he had not used since childhood, prayers and curses mixed together. He thought about the wife he might have had, the children he might have raised, the life he might have lived in a town where neighbors could hear you scream and would come to help. He thought about the dog which had known something weeks before he did, and which had chosen to leave rather than stay, and watch what happened. He thought about the haulers who would climb the trail in September, and whether they would find him alive or dead. On a night in late July, the breathing stopped. This was not a gradual fading the way the sounds had sometimes diminished only to return louder and closer than before. This was an absolute cessation, a silence so complete that Crane thought he had gone deaf. He stood at the bench with a draw knife in his hand, listening to the absence of sound, and felt something worse than fear. He felt hope. The hope was more terrible than any threat, because it meant he still believed in escape, and belief was the most vulnerable part of him. He almost opened the door. The barricades were within reach, the staves and iron hoops he had driven into the frame 6 weeks before, and removing them would have been simple. He could step onto the porch and smell the night air, and look up at the stars above Miller's brow. The silence seemed to encourage this, holding itself still and breathless to lure him out, until he took one step toward the door, then another, and his hand rested on the first iron hoop when the voice spoke. It was his voice. Not a voice like his, not an approximation, but his voice with every nuance and flaw that 53 years in the Blue Ridge had produced. The Appalachian inflection that flattened certain vowels and sharpened others, the slight rasp from inhaling oak dust for 3 decades, the wet click in the throat. All of it was there, reproduced with a fidelity no human mimic could achieve, but the voice was not speaking words Crane had spoken. It was speaking words he had spoken before, rearranged into sentences that had no meaning. The staves are wet, the fire is low. I am here, you are here. These were phrases Crane had used, words that belonged to his vocabulary. But they were assembled by something that did not understand what language was for. The voice spoke them with perfect pronunciation and no comprehension, the way a parrot speaks, or a recording device playing back fragments of a conversation it had overheard. The sentences were grammatically correct, but semantically empty, like the breathing that had preceded them. They were the sound of meaning without the substance. The voice came from everywhere. It came from the walls, from the floor, from the space inside the barrels, from the rafters above his head. It spoke in Crane's voice from 3 directions at once, slightly out of phase, creating an effect like a chorus of Ezekiel Cranes reciting the same meaningless phrases at slightly different moments. Then, as Crane stood paralyzed with his hand still on the iron hoop, the voice stopped speaking words and began to breathe again. But this time, the breathing was not matching him. Crane was holding his breath, had been holding it since the first words were spoken, his lungs burning and his throat closed against the scream that wanted to escape. The breathing continued without him, preserving the pattern of his respiration in his absence through a rhythm it had learned. Then it changed. It slowed, deepened, became the breathing of a man at rest rather than a man in terror. And Crane, without deciding to, began to breathe in time with it. His lungs relaxed and fell into the rhythm that the voice provided. He was no longer the original. He was the copy, following a pattern that something else had established. This was the moment when Crane understood that the door was irrelevant. The walls were irrelevant. The barricades and the bolts and the iron hoops were gestures without meaning. like a child drawing a chalk circle to keep away a monster. The entity was not outside. It had never been outside. It was in the air, in the wood, in the dust, in the resonance of the hollow itself. It had learned Ezekiel Crane so thoroughly that it no longer needed him to produce the sounds. It could generate them independently, and it could generate them so well that Crane's own body recognized the copy as the original and adjusted itself to match. He let go of the iron hoop, walked back to the bench, and sat down. The draw knife stayed on the workbench where he had left it. He sat with his hands in his lap and listened to his own breathing, produced from everywhere and nowhere, waiting for whatever would come next. No fear remained. No hope remained. There was only the sound, and the waiting, and the slow dissolution of the boundary between one thing and another. Hollis Barger made the climb to Miller's Brow on the last Thursday of April 1887. He was making his spring rounds, collecting barrels from 3 coopers who worked the high hollows, and Crane's cabin was the last stop on a route that took 2 days from the valley floor. The trail was muddy from spring rains, and Barger was in a hurry to finish and get back to his own farm before dark. He did not notice anything wrong until he reached the shelf of land where the cabin sat and saw that the dog was not there to greet him. Barger called Crane's name from the clearing below the cabin. He received no answer. The cabin looked the same as it always had, a weathered structure of poplar and oak that had settled into the slope as if it had grown there. But there was a quality to this silence that made Barger stop before he reached the porch. It was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of something holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do. He knocked on the door. The sound was strange, muffled, as if the planks had been covered with something on the inside. He knocked again harder, and called out that he was there for the fall orders, that he had payment in cornmeal and salt, that it was time to open up. No response. Barger tried the latch and found it secure, then noticed the barricade. The iron hoops driven into the frame, the staves wedged between the door and the wall, the third bolt that had not been there in the autumn of 1885. This was not the work of a man expecting visitors. This was the work of a man who had stopped expecting anything. Barger forced the door with a crowbar he carried for emergencies. The barricades gave way with a screech of iron on wood that carried down the hollow, and returned from 2 ridges. He stepped inside and smelled that something was wrong. The air was thick and still heavy with oak dust and human decay, and underneath these smells was a quality of occupancy that did not match the empty room. Crane lay on the floor of the workshop, curled on his side around an unfinished barrel. His body had rested there for months, long enough that the soft tissues collapsed and the fluids soaked into the dirt floor, leaving a dark stained Barger, later described as the shadow of a man rather than remains. Crane's mouth hung open, and his lungs were full of air that hadn't moved since the previous summer. The body bore no marks and showed no sign of violence, leaving no indication of how he died. The barricades held. No one had breached the door from outside, and the windows remained intact. The glass panes Crane installed years before still unbroken and undisturbed. Whatever killed Ezekiel Crane did so without entering the cabin, or it entered through a means that left no trace. Barger did not speculate about this in his account. He was a practical man who had seen death in many forms during his travels through the high hollows, but he noted carefully and without elaboration that nothing about that isolated cooper's cabin was normal. The barrels told their own story. 3 casks, Crane completed before the trouble started, remained sound and tight, capable of holding liquid without leaking. They sat against the wall like witnesses, their oak surfaces darkened with age and dust. The unfinished barrels told a different story. Their staves had warped in the humidity, and the iron hoops rusted into place. Some collapsed inward, as if whatever they were meant to contain had grown too heavy for the wood to bear. Barger left them where they lay. He loaded the 3 sound barrels onto his mule and closed the door behind him. He never replaced the barricades, and he never climbed the trail to Miller's Brow again. The locals, in the valley below, heard Barger's account, and they avoided the hollow. This is not unusual in mountain communities. Certain places acquire reputations that have nothing to do with ghost stories and everything to do with practical wisdom. But over the years, stories accumulated. Hunters who passed near Miller's Brow at night reported hearing the ring of a hammer on iron, the sound of a cooper at work, coming from a cabin that had been empty for decades. Others said they heard breathing from the tree line, their own respiration thrown back from the rhododendron thickets, perfectly matched and slightly delayed. The cabin fell down eventually, as all wooden structures do when no one maintains them against the mountain winters. The roof collapsed first, then the walls, until only the stone foundation remained, overgrown with laurel and poison ivy within a generation. But the stories persisted. They became part of the oral tradition, one of the many tales that the Appalachian Mountains keep in their hollows and ridges, adapting themselves to each new teller and listener. We don't know what happened to Ezekiel Crane. We don't know whether he was killed by something that learned to imitate him, or whether he died of madness, starvation, or simple exhaustion in a sealed room where the air had become too thick to breathe. The Appalachian mimic voice folklore, documented by folklorists at East Tennessee State University, suggests that the mountains themselves can produce sounds that imitate human voices with disturbing precision. The natural acoustics of bowl-shaped hollows, the reflection of sound off quartz-bearing rock, the behavior of wind in dense fog. These phenomena can create experiences that feel supernatural without requiring any supernatural explanation. But they don't explain everything. Nothing in the research explains why Crane stopped opening his door, or why he barricaded himself inside his workshop with iron and oak. It doesn't explain the breathing that learned his rhythm and then improved on it, or the voice that spoke his words without understanding them. These details belong to a story that has no clear origin and no clean ending. A recovered history from the dark heart of Appalachia that leaves the listener with a question rather than an answer. Ezekiel Crane didn't die from something that broke down his door. He died from something that learned to be him breath by breath, until there wasn't room for both. If you want more stories like this, recovered from the places the mountains still keep hidden, subscribe. The ridge has more secrets than anyone has lived to tell.